Welcome back and thanks for staying with us. Political analyst Khaya Sithole joins us now via Skype to talk about the economic impact of the lockdown extension that was announced by President Cyril Ramaphosa last night. Khaya, very good morning to you and thank you so much for joining us. It's a reality now, isn't it? What's your sense of the tone and the intent of the extension?
Good morning. I think obviously what we are really living in are unknown times. And when we do live in a situation like this, it's always important for decisions to be driven by the most credible information and the facts that you can find. And I think from what we heard yesterday, the President and his National Command Council have looked at the data that has been generated since the start of the lockdown. They've compared it to other countries and they've also taken, advice from important agencies like the World Health Organization. And they've come to the realization that to lift the moratorium on people moving around would be a bit premature, and think of the consequences that might arise should we then turn out to have lifted it prematurely. So I do think that it was not surprising that the extension was granted. It was always going to be a question of how long the extension is going to be for, but also quite importantly, what does the government seek to do during that extension? Because we know that the biggest problem that we have is simply the fact that we haven't tested enough people. So the question of how widespread and prevalent the disease or the infections are across the country remains a great unknown. We've so far relied on people who either have symptoms to come forward and say, look, I'd like to be tested, or people who fit a particular profile of either having interacted with people who've tested positives or had similar exposures. Now, of course, that means that we are still at the mercy of the people who've taken the decision to come forward and say a test is warranted, rather than us having done a universal assessment of everyone and saying based on the statistics of the data that we can find in a particular province, we think the rate of infection is XYZ, so therefore this is how we must proceed in managing it.
Does it give the process more credibility that the presidency is bringing on the Human Science and Research Council to help in terms of the collection of data?
Yeah, that's very important, because one would always question the type of information that government has access to and how they then translate it and then extrapolate it onto a bigger audience. So I think the government being able to have access to agencies like StatsSA, like the Human Sciences Research Council, is also helping them be able to back up the type of decision making that they are embarking upon, because the question would always be, well, on what basis are you making this decision? So if they're then listening to a lot of experts in different fields, it means that at least in the process of decision making, they're exploring the multiple permutations, they're looking at what the possibilities might be before then taking the view that actually, based on what we see and based on what we think South African patterns are going to be like, this is what we think ought to happen.
Let's look at the three-part strategy that the President presented: an intensified public health response to slow down and reduce the infections, a comprehensive package of economic support measures to assist business and individuals affected by the pandemic, and a program of increased social support to protect the poor and vulnerable households. Your thoughts about the strategy?
Yeah, so when you think of what the government then needs to do, the government is obviously not immune to the reality that this has consequences for human beings at all levels. So whether it's people who are now suddenly unable to earn an income because their ability to earn an income is completely linked to their ability to be present at places where they either work or where they offer their services, that is a reality that we're facing here. So when you're then looking at what the state's response ought to be, well, firstly, primarily, there has to be the health response, which is to say you need to test as many people as possible so that we at least have an idea of what it is that we're fighting. We know that it's a health pandemic, but what exactly is the scale of it? So that is obviously the most critical of all responses. And then to come back and say, well, now that over a 5-week period that we've allocated to us managing this crisis, how do we then cushion you from the inevitable socio-economic fallout? And that's when obviously the question of whatever stimulus package that the government can put together that can then either help people at an individual level or even businesses through the bigger economy to be able to say that we acknowledge that these are not ordinary times, but of course life has to carry on in one way or another. So this is the type of assistance that we want to be able to put together on the table in order to assist people transition themselves through this particular period. So all of those initiatives are individually and collectively aimed at firstly acknowledging that this has been disruptive for absolutely everybody, but also the fact that the ability of people to survive it is very very different, and it's fundamentally linked to their prevailing socio-economic circumstances. And for far too many people in South Africa, the socio-economic profile is indicative of people who need help on a general level, but more specifically in instances like this, where even their own ability to try and make ends meet has been curtailed.
We keep talking about business and economic impacts, and this week is one of the busiest weeks in terms of economic activity, it being the Holy Week in the Christian community. How are we calculating these impacts?
Well, I suppose the way we always look at economic data is that generally it's always a retrospective science. We try to collect as many data points as possible and then say, based on what we've seen, we actually think this is what the impact had been. Now, in a situation like this where you have to be quite proactive, the difficulty is that sometimes the way data is collected has to be different to what you've done before. So what you would do is that you'd use history as a basis for saying, well, actually, we now know that in an instance where perhaps one sector has been disrupted either through load shedding, for example, or something similar, some other external factor, we've seen historically that when that happens, this becomes a consequence on the sector, this becomes a consequence on the people that work the sector, and then this becomes a consequence on the people that are part of that sector's value chain. So it actually then use the same type of inputs and variables and then say, now that we've got a universal disruption across all sectors and across all economic spheres, what is the impact likely going to be? But of course, what will then happen is that much later on, once the data has actually been matched by real life experiences, then Stats SA will come back and say, well, the true impact happened to have been X, Y, and Z. So at this stage, you need to be able to sort of formulate your decision making based on what the variables that are known might do to the economy. And when you're then looking at those variables and then you extrapolate them on a bigger population, then you'll say, we suspect that the consequence is going to be X, Y, Z. So therefore, in order for us to minimize or to mitigate the effect of that consequence, these are the type of interventions that we can put together. Unfortunately, government's primary problem is that it's limited in terms of resources, which is why initiatives like the Solidarity Fund are a useful instrument here in us saying that, well, there might be some of us who are fortunate enough to have some excess cash reserves sitting somewhere that we can then allocate to the Solidarity Fund so that the reach of the initiatives that government has crafted can be much wider than what it otherwise would be if only government had to do it.
Khaya, the president emphasized the fact that in making his decisions, he called the different political parties who are represented in parliament. What does this say to the collaborative nature of this process?
The importance of the president actually reaching out to all the various political and social partners cannot be, overemphasized. It's become a real trump card that the president has in saying that I'm not managing a ANC political problem, I'm not managing an ANC government political problem, I'm managing a problem that is so universal it affects all South Africans regardless of political persuasions and economic profile or even racial profile. So of course, if I'm going to say that I'm managing that type of a problem, I need to be able to reach across the table and speak to everybody who has a particular interest. Now, of course, political parties do represent particular constituencies, and if you are able to reach out to them and say, look, this is a decision that we've taken, please go and communicate it in your constituency in whichever way you interact with your constituency, and also please buy into it, that becomes quite important. Because I think the reality is that a lot of people attach a lot of capital to what their political leaders and what their political principles say. So imagine a situation where the government says this is the way forward, and then a particular politician who has a significant following in one form or another says something completely different, and then that gets seen by that politician's constituency as a license to either rebel against the measures that have been put in place or to simply bypass them. Now, that is something that is completely untenable, particularly because the consequences are so dire that you might then see a rise in infections. But of course, those infections are not going to be limited to just the people that have decided to listen to the rogue politician, for example. The consequences are going to be universal. They're going to affect people in that person's immediate community and then might go bigger than that. So I think it's important for him to keep bringing the different political parties together and say, this is the line of march, this is the way forward, and give them an opportunity to either interrogate or to sort of put inputs into what he's saying, and then give him a position to then say, this is what I'm going to say to the nation at large, so that everybody is of the same view and of the same understanding of what it is that we're trying to achieve.
Let's thank you for your time this morning.